Easy English reading. For the love of a man.
There were 3 men with 3 dogs. The men's names were Thornton, Hans, and Pete. John Thornton was the leader of the party. Hans and Pete were his helpers. The dogs' names were Buck, Skeet, and Nig. It was early spring. All 6 of them were waiting for the Yukon to open. Then the men could build a boat and go down the river. They were all good friends, dogs and men. Even the dogs were friends. Dogs often fight, but these 3 never fought. Buck, a big, strong Newfoundland from the south, had a wound in his back. It was a very big wound. He spent most of his time lying on the riverbank, and as he lay there through the long spring days, watching the water flow, listening to the birds sing, he felt his strength come back to him. His friends helped him as best they could. Every day Thornton washed his wound and Skeet washed his too. Skeet was a small Irish setter who had the instincts of a doctor. Like a mother cat licking her kittens, she licked Buck's wounds. Regularly, every morning after breakfast, she would begin her work and continue it for about 20 minutes. Nig was Buck's other great friend. He was a big black dog with a good nature and laughing eyes. Buck was great friends with all of them, but he really loved only one man, his master, Thornton. Who is loved by his dogs? Only the ideal master, the master who cares for his dogs as a father and mother care for their children. Thornton was such an ideal master. He not only gave his dogs food when they were hungry, not only gave them water when they wanted to drink, not only gave them a place to sleep at night, he talked to them. In fact, he talked to them as he talked to people. How often he sat down with his 3 dogs around him and spoke kind words to them, putting his hands on the head of one and then on the head of the other. But of the 3 dogs, he loved Buck the most. With Buck, he had a special way of showing his love. He would often take the dog's head between his hands, then put his own head on Buck's and finally give him a little shake, calling him several friendly names at the same time. But Buck also had a special way of showing his love. He liked to take Thornton's hand in his mouth and then close his mouth. He did not bite, but you could see the imprint of his teeth for some time afterwards. Buck was not a civilized dog, he was a wild dog. He never put his head on Thornton's knee like Nig did, and he never put his nose under Thornton's hand like Skeet did. Only sometimes he came up to Thornton and took Thornton's hand in his mouth. But he never came up to other people. He never came up to Hans and Pete. He loved a man, but he loved only one man, and he liked to fight. Skeet and Nig were his friends, and he never fought with them. But if he saw another dog, he would start a fight. And it was always a fight to the death. He knew only too well the law of the wilderness: kill or be killed, eat or be eaten. Spring had finally come. The river was now free of ice, and the men finished the boat. One morning, Pete came to Thornton and said, "The boat is ready, we can start." The next day, they headed down the river. Thornton put all his food and the 3 dogs on the boat. Then he, Pete, and Hans got into the boat themselves, and Thornton pushed off. The men began to work energetically with their oars. It was difficult getting down the river. In many places, the flow was very strong, and it was necessary for the men and dogs to get off. Only Thornton stood in the back part of the boat all the time, working with one oar. Pete and Hans tied a rope to the boat and went along the bank. In some places, the current was so strong that Hans and Pete had to pull the boat back, and it was not an easy job. At one particularly bad spot, about halfway down the river, Hans and Pete suddenly pulled the boat with great force, and Thornton fell into the water. The current carried him down with great speed. One moment, he was just a little black spot in the white and blue river. The next moment, Hans and Pete saw him no more. Buck jumped into the water the second he saw Thornton's fall. In a minute, he too was just a little black spot in the white and blue of the river. At first, Thornton understood nothing. He just felt the cold and saw water all around him. But then he thought, I've got to swim to the bank. But no, he could not swim to the bank. He was not a good swimmer, and then it was too far and the current was too strong. He looked back, but he could not see Pete and Hans. But what was that black spot in the water behind him? He looked back again. It was Buck. In a minute, the dog was behind him, and in another minute, Thornton was holding him by the tail. Now I am saved, Thornton thought. The dog began to beat the water furiously with his paws. But the bank was no nearer. The current was too strong. In a moment, Thornton saw that Buck could do nothing, and then, suddenly, Thornton felt himself bumping into something hard. Both he and Buck stopped. The river flowed past them. They were on a big rock just under the water, but how long could he stay there? The rock was very slippery. He could not stay on it for more than a few minutes. I must send Buck for help, he thought. And then he commanded, Go, Buck, go! Buck looked at him. He understood Thornton's order. He understood that only he could save his master, and he understood that he alone could save his master, and he understood that to save his master it was necessary to leave him and to swim to the bank. The next moment he was far, far down the river, a black spot in the white-blue water. He came to the bank about half a mile lower down the river. Hans and Pete saw the dog and helped him out of the water. They looked up the river and saw Thornton sitting on a rock. Now, something had to be done quickly. Hans and Pete knew very well that a man could not stay on a slippery rock for long. It was a matter of minutes. So they called Buck and ran up the bank as fast as they could. They had to get much higher than Thornton's rock. Only then could they help Thornton. They ran for almost a mile. Finally, they came to a place far above Thornton's stone. Here they stopped, and Hans tied a long rope to Buck. Go, Buck! He shouted to the dog. Buck jumped right into the river. In a few seconds, the current carried him to the stone. Thornton was still there. The moment Buck came to him, Thornton put his arms around the dog's neck. Hans and Pete started to pull, and now Thornton and Buck began their terrible journey to the bank. At first, Thornton's eyes were closed and his face was pale, but he was not badly hurt. In a moment, he opened his eyes and looked first to the right and then to the left. He didn't say a word, but his eyes asked, "Where is Buck?" Hans understood him. He pointed to the boat. Buck was lying there. He was not killed, but badly wounded, and Skeet was already licking a new wound in his leg. "We've got to stop here," said Thornton. "We've got to stop here, not only till I get well, but till the dog gets well." And they stopped there for a month, until Buck and he were well again. That same winter, Buck did another great thing. One day they were sitting in a bar, Thornton, Hans, and Pete. There were a lot of other people in the bar, and they were all drinking and talking about dogs. Every man said he had the best dog. Thornton said the same thing. He knew that Buck was the strongest and best dog of them all. One man said, "I have a dog that can start a sledge with 500 pounds. Another man said, "And I have a dog that can start a sledge with 600 pounds, and my dog can run with it." A third man said his dog could start a sledge with 700 pounds. And a fourth man said that 750 pounds was not too much for his dog. "Pooh, pooh," said John Thornton. "Buck can start with 1,000 pounds. "And walk off with it for 100 yards? asked Matthewson, one of the men in the bar. "Yes, and walk off with it 100 yards, answered Thornton. "Well," said Matthewson, "I have $1,000 here, and I will give it to you if the dog does it, but will you give me 1,000 if he does not start a sledge?" Thornton did not answer. He did not know what to say. Half a ton. Could Buck really do it? And then he did not have the $1,000. "I've got a sledge here with 20 50-pound sacks on it," Matthewson went on. Thornton looked at the faces of everyone in the bar. Among them, he saw the face of an old friend, O'Brien. "Can you give me 1,000?" he asked him. "Yes, I can," said O'Brien. "But do you really think your dog can do it?" In less than a minute, the bar was empty. All the men were standing around Matthewson's sledge. "No, the dog can't start the sledge," they said. Matthewson laughed. "I'll give you 2,000 if he starts the sledge," he said. In a moment, Buck was harnessed to the sledge. Thornton came up to him and looked into his wise black eyes. He thought the dog understood. "As you love me, Buck, as you love me," he said to the dog. Then came the short pause. "Now, Buck!" He motioned to the dog. Buck pulled, but the sledge did not move. "Now!" yelled Thornton again. Again Buck pulled, and this time the sledge moved just a little to the right. And then Buck understood. He understood that it was not right to pull straight. It was necessary to pull first to the right and then to the left. And that is what he did. He began to pull first to the right and then to the left. The sledge moved to the right, then a little to the left, then more to the right, then more to the left, and then it started. "Now go!" Thornton's command was like a revolver shot, and the sledge moved. Slowly, slowly, first half a foot, then 2 feet, and now it was moving quite well. There was absolute silence. Nobody said a word. The silence lasted for 10 minutes, and for 10 minutes the sledge moved on. But then, as the sledge passed the 100 yards, all the men began to cry, and all the hats went up in the air. Matthewson himself cried, "Sell me the dog. I will give you $3,000 for him." But Thornton did not listen. He went over to Buck. He took Buck's head in his hands. Then he put his own head on Buck's, and finally he began to shake the dog a little, and Buck put Thornton's hand in his mouth.